There's an old saying about how a king sits on his throne because he's the strongest, the one who can command. And for a long time, most men bought into that. Thought that if you could just bark loud enough, push hard enough, everything would fall in line. They believed the weight of the crown was in the iron of it, not in the shoulders that carried it for others. They mistook the roar for the wisdom, the iron fist for the steady hand. Thought that leadership was about showing everyone who was boss, about having the last word, about never letting anyone see you sweat, or worse, see you think you might not know everything. But life, she's a funny teacher. She'll let you stumble around in the dark for a good long while, convinced you're holding the only flashlight, until you finally trip over a root so big it takes you down for good. And it's only then, when you're flat on your back, staring up at the same stars everyone else sees, that you realize maybe, just maybe, the light wasn't just yours to begin with. Eugene was one of those men who believed he held the flashlight. 47 years old, a construction foreman with a company he'd built brick by hard brick, and he carried every one of those bricks on his shoulders. You'd see him on a job site, even before the sun had fully burned off the morning chill, and know instantly what he was. His face, etched with lines deeper than any blueprint, looked like it had been chiseled from granite, a bit weary around the eyes, yes, but mostly just resolute, no nonsense. His hair, a salt and pepper buzz cut, sat atop a neck that seemed permanently braced for a fight. His hands, though, those were the real story. Wide and thick, the knuckles scarred, the nails perpetually rimmed with the fine dust of concrete or splintered wood. They looked like tools themselves, capable of incredible precision when he was fitting a beam or crushing a beer can without thinking twice. He moved with a kind of heavy efficiency, never wasted a step, never made a motion that didn't serve a purpose. He'd walk onto a site, eyes sweeping, taking everything in, and usually the first words out of his mouth weren't a greeting, but an order sharp and direct, cutting through the clang and hum of the morning like a saw through soft pine. He expected compliance. He expected things done his way because his way, he figured, was the only way things ever got done right. He was the boss, after all, and the boss knew best. Or so he told himself every damn morning. Some men, they learn leadership from the rumble of heavy machinery and the stark lines of a blueprint. They learn it from sweat stinging their eyes and the bone-deep ache of a day well spent. They figure that if you're the one holding the plans, the one who's been around long enough to see the ground turn from mud to foundation, then you're the one who knows how things ought to be. And knowing how things ought to be, they reckon, means telling everyone else how to do it, down to the last nail. They believe that power is in the bark of a command, in the firm hand on the wheel, in never, ever showing a crack in the armor. It's a common enough belief, carved into the very bedrock of 1,000 construction sites and factory floors across this country. A man feels the weight of responsibility, the risk of failure, and he tightens his grip, convinces himself that control is the only anchor in a sea of uncertainty where every decision felt like it could either build a fortune or bury him alive. Eugene's world started not with the dawn, but with the rasp of a digital alarm clock at 5:00 a.m. It was the same alarm, the same time, 5 days a week, sometimes 6, for as long as he could remember. Before the sun had even thought about stretching its rays across the working-class suburb where he lived, Eugene was already up. He'd swing his feet to the worn linoleum, the chill of the morning seeping into his bones even through his thick work socks. The coffee machine was his first companion, its gurgle a familiar symphony in the quiet house. Maria, his wife, would still be asleep, the soft rise and fall of her breathing a testament to the brief peace before the day descended. He'd stand by the kitchen window, cupping the hot mug, watching the streetlights blink off one by one, the sky slowly bleeding from indigo to bruised purple. His modest ranch house, well-maintained but never fancy, felt like both a fortress and a cage. Then came the ritual. Jeans, a faded work shirt, his steel-toed boots heavy and scuffed, each crease a story of mud, concrete, and long days. He'd check the worn wallet in his back pocket, a quick glance at the bills, a familiar knot tightening in his gut. The mortgage payment due next week. Leo, his 16-year-old, needed new tires for his beat-up hand-me-down truck, and college was closer than it seemed. Sophia, his 12-year-old, had braces that felt like they cost more than a small car. The numbers never seemed to add up to enough, not with the way things were going at the company. Every new project felt less like an opportunity and more like another roll of the dice, another mountain to climb just to stay on the same flat ground. His drive to the site was a blur of familiar turns, past gas stations just opening, past other men in other trucks, all heading to their own grind. He'd listen to the morning news, half hearing the endless chatter about interest rates and political squabbles, his mind already on the day's pour, the framing schedule, the subcontractor who was always late. Monotony, some might call it, but to Eugene, it was the rhythm of his life, a drumbeat of responsibility that never faltered. He was good at it, damn good. He knew every angle, every trick of the trade. But good didn't always mean easy, and it sure as hell didn't mean prosperous, not the way he'd once envisioned. Inside, beneath the gruff exterior and the constant clench of his jaw, was a deeper unease, a quiet knowing that no amount of work could silence. Eugene cared about doing things right, not just for the bottom line, but for the inherent pride in a job well done, a structure built to last. He craved respect, the kind of knowing nod that came from men who understood the craft. But that respect felt like it was slipping, replaced by the hushed complaints of his crew, the high turnover that kept him constantly breaking in new blood, the quiet resentment he could feel simmering just below the surface of their compliance. He feared failure, not just the financial ruin that would shatter the life he'd built for Maria and the kids, but the profound personal failure of not being enough. Not being the man he'd promised himself he'd be when he first started this company with a handshake and a beat-up truck. There was a younger Eugene, a man with a different gleam in his eye, who dreamt of a company that wasn't just about making money, but about building legacies, about a brotherhood of craftsmen. D wanted to be the kind of leader who inspired, not just commanded. But somewhere along the way, the pressure had twisted that dream, hardening him, convincing him that control, absolute, unyielding control, was the only path to survival. He told himself it was for their own good, for the good of the company, for the good of his family. If he didn't push, if he didn't dictate, if he didn't always know best, then who would? Who would pick up the pieces when things went sideways? He buried the quiet worry he had for his team's well-being beneath layers of instruction and impatience. He saw their tired faces, heard their strained laughs, knew the weight of their own bills. He just didn't know how to acknowledge it without sounding soft, without betraying the image of the unshakable boss he'd painstakingly constructed over decades. Vulnerability, to Eugene, felt like a structural weakness, a crack in the foundation that could bring the whole damn thing down. So he kept his distance, kept his counsel, and kept his fear of failure locked tight, letting it fester and manifest as short temper and an inability to trust anyone to do things his way, which was, in his mind, the right way. The gap between the proud, confident builder he was on the surface and the worried, secretly yearning man underneath grew wider with every passing year, every terse order, every ignored suggestion from the men he paid to work for him. And it was a gap that was about to swallow him whole. The gap swallowed him whole not with a sudden lurch, but with the slow, agonizing creak of straining timbers, the kind that whispers of collapse long before the first beam hits the ground. It started with Greenwood Heights. A big job, this one, a complex of townhouses on the edge of town, the kind of contract that could either make or break a smaller outfit like his. For weeks, Eugene had been on it like a dog on a bone, every morning barking out assignments, every afternoon inspecting every nail, every cut, every angle. He de-ordered the foundation crew to pour on a Tuesday despite a junior foreman, a sharp kid named Mateo, gently suggesting the ground felt a little too soft after the weekend rain. "I know my ground, Mateo," Eugene had snapped, his voice echoing in the early morning chill. "And I know the schedule. Pour it." Mateo had just nodded, his shoulders slumping, and driven off to organize the concrete trucks. Eugene had watched him go, feeling that familiar prickle of irritation at perceived insubordination, quickly squashing the tiny voice in his own head that wondered if Mateo might have a point. He was the boss. He made the calls. 2 weeks later, the engineer's report came back. Minor subsidence. A catastrophic, not yet, but enough to warrant a complete reevaluation, a structural reinforcement. A delay, a cost. Eugene had felt a knot tighten in his gut, but he'd shoved it down, blamed the weather, blamed the soil, blamed anyone but himself. "Amateurs," he'd muttered under his breath, even though the issue had stemmed directly from his own uncompromising directive. Then came the framing. He'd meticulously drawn up the cut lists, measured twice, triple-checked everything. But on site, the team was moving slower than molasses. Old Man Johnson, a carpenter who could frame a house blindfolded, had tried to show Eugene a more efficient way to jig the rafters, a trick he'd picked up back in his union days. "We do it my way, Frank," Eugene had grunted, cutting him off mid-sentence. "No shortcuts, no fancy ideas, just follow the prints." Frank had just sighed, a sound that carried the weight of 30 years on a job site and went back to wrestling a cumbersome beam into place, his way the slow way, Eugene's way. A few days later, a critical load-bearing wall was installed off-kilter by mere inches. Small, invisible to the untrained eye, but enough to throw off the entire upper floor. It meant tearing down a section, recutting materials, hours of labor wasted. And the worst part. Eugene overheard Leo, his apprentice, tell another worker, "If Eugene just let us do it the way we know works, we'd be done by now." Leo, his own son. The sting was sharper than any hammer blow. But still, Eugene had clenched his jaw, chalked it up to careless work, and pushed harder, barked louder. The real disaster hit a month after the framing was supposedly complete. The electricians were pulling wire, and suddenly a whole section of the newly installed drywall had to be ripped out. Turns out, the conduit lines, ordered by Eugene based on an outdated schematic he'd refused to re-verify, were routed directly through a newly added structural brace. A miscommunication, a missed detail, a classic case of nobody speaking up because every time they did, they got shut down. This wasn't just a snag. This was a full-blown catastrophe. Ripping out newly installed drywall, rerouting electrical, structural engineers back on site, reordering custom materials. The subcontractor was fuming. The client, a notoriously demanding developer, was threatening to pull the contract. The penalties alone would gut Eugene's company. He saw his profit margin, already razor-thin, vanish like smoke. The bank account, already struggling, was about to go into the red. He stood there amidst the dust and debris, watching his crew. They weren't angry. They were just defeated, resigned, and in their eyes he saw it. Not just frustration, but a deep, quiet resentment. He'd broken their spirit. He hadn't just ignored their input, he'd crushed their willingness to even have input. And now the company, the livelihood he'd built with his own 2 hands, was teetering on the edge of collapse, not because of bad luck, but because of him. The silence of the job site, usually a symphony of saws and hammers, was now a deafening accusation. He felt a cold dread settle in his bones, heavier than any I-beam. This wasn't just a bad project. This was an existential threat. That night, Eugene didn't even try to sleep. He lay in bed until Maria's gentle breathing filled the room, then he slipped out, a ghost in his own house. The kitchen was dark, save for the faint glow of the street lamp filtering through the blinds. He poured himself a glass of water, then just sat at the kitchen table, the chipped formica cool beneath his forearms. 3 a.m., the loneliest hour. The silence of the house was a heavy blanket, suffocating him. He could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator, the settling creaks of the old ranch house. Each sound seemed to amplify the gnawing despair in his gut. The faces of his crew flashed before his eyes. Mateo's slumped shoulders, Frank's tired sigh, Leo's hurt expression. He'd seen all those signs, dismissed them as weakness, as whining, as resistance to his superior knowledge. How many times had he barked, "My way or the highway"? How many good men had walked that highway, taking their skills, their loyalty, their quiet wisdom with them? Too many. The turnover rate, once just a number on a spreadsheet he'd blamed on a lazy generation, now felt like a gravestone for every relationship he'd ruined. He thought of the bank's statements, the red numbers staring back at him, mocking his pride. Thought of the letter from the client's lawyer, stark black words on crisp white paper outlining the penalties, the damaged reputation. Not just for him, but for Eugene's construction, the name he'd painted on the side of his first beat-up Ford pickup. It was more than a company. It was his legacy, the thing he hoped to pass to Leo, to show his family he'd built something real, something lasting. Now it was a crumbling edifice, just like that damn load-bearing wall. What had his life become? A ceaseless grind, fueled by stress and anger, yielding nothing but more stress and anger. He'd always imagined himself a craftsman, a builder, someone who created beauty and strength. Instead, he was a foreman who tore things down, morale, trust, the very foundations of his business. He saw himself in that moment. A man pushing 50, tired to his bones, alienated from his crew, on the verge of losing everything. The strong, unshakable boss he'd tried to be was a sham, a paper tiger. All that bluster, all that control had been a desperate attempt to hide his own fear, his deep-seated terror of failing Maria, of failing his kids, of failing himself. The truth, raw and unvarnished, hit him like a 2x4 to the head. He wasn't leading. He was pushing. He wasn't building. He was destroying. He wasn't protecting his family. He was jeopardizing their future with his stubborn pride. He was the problem, not the weather, not the economy, not the lazy crew. Him. The silence of the night swallowed that confession, but the echoes resonated in his soul, shaking him to the core. He had been so busy being the boss, he'd forgot how to be human. And that was a foundation that no amount of concrete could fix. But a foundation, even a bad one, had to be strong enough to crack. And crack it did on the Northwood Plaza project, the biggest gig Eugene had landed in 5 years. A 4-story office block, a jewel in the portfolio, a chance to finally get ahead. The problem started with a drainage plan for the main parking garage slab. A subtle dip, a critical slope that was supposed to guide water to the drains, but the architect's drawing was, to put it mildly, a damn scribble. Marco, one of his younger guys, sharp as a tack with CAD, came to Eugene weeks before. "Boss," he'd said, "this grade here, it just doesn't look right. If we follow this, water's gonna pool like a dam lake right by the entrance." Eugene had barely glanced up from his blueprints, a heavy marker in his hand. "Looks fine to me, Marco. You think I haven't poured 100,000 square feet of concrete? You follow the plan. That's what we get paid for." He de-waved him off, a dismissive flick of the wrist. Marco, the enthusiasm draining from his face like water down a faulty pipe, just nodded, tucked his drawing under his arm, and walked away. The rest of the crew standing nearby had seen it. They'd heard it. Another good idea, another voice, swallowed whole by Eugene's absolute certainty. They poured the slab, 100 yards of concrete, perfect in its smoothness, gleaming under the sun. For a few days, it looked like a victory. Then came the first heavy rain. And true to Marco's unspoken warning, a vast, shallow lake formed right at the main garage entrance, reflecting the gray sky like a broken mirror. Not a puddle, not a minor issue. A standing body of water several inches deep, a permanent hazard, a testament to a fundamental failure. The architect, when he saw it, turned a shade of purple usually reserved for bruised fruit. The client, a fastidious man in an expensive suit, walked slowly to the edge of the pooling water, didn't say a word, just stared at it, then at Eugene, a look of profound disappointment that cut deeper than any shout. The silence was deafening. Eugene felt the blood drain from his face, leaving a cold, clammy film. He looked at Marco, who was staring at his boots, shoulders slumped. The unspoken "I told you so" hung heavy in the damp air. It wasn't just a mistake. It was an act of corporate sabotage, self-inflicted. The remediation was brutal. Weeks of delays, penalty clauses kicking in, material costs for new rebar and concrete. The sound of jackhammers tearing into that perfectly smooth, perfectly wrong slab echoed like a funeral dirge for his pride, for his business. Every strike was a blow to his bank account, to his reputation. The crew worked with grim efficiency, but their usual banter was gone, replaced by a quiet resentment, a cold professional distance. They were just turning up, putting in the hours, not building with the heart they used to. He'd killed it, that spark, and now he was paying for the cremation. That night the house was quiet. Maria and the kids were asleep, their breaths soft and even. Eugene sat at the kitchen table, the low hum of the refrigerator the only sound breaking the silence. It was 3 a.m. The pale glow from the stove light cast long shadows, making the coffee cup in his hand look like an archaeological find. Spread out before him were the printouts. The revised project schedule, the penalty invoice, the estimates for the repour. Red ink bled across the page, a river of losses. It wasn't just a loss of profit. It was a hemorrhaging of working capital, a gash that threatened to bleed the company dry. He thought of Marco's face, that quiet, knowing look. He thought of all the other times he'd shut down an idea, stifled a question, dismissed a concern with a gruff word or an impatient wave of the hand. He'd been so convinced he was the smartest guy in the room, so afraid of looking weak, of admitting he didn't know everything, that he'd become blind. Blind to talent, blind to warning signs, blind to the slow erosion of trust. He closed his eyes, the image of that artificial lake at the Northwood Plaza entrance burned into his mind. It wasn't just water pooling. It was all the unspoken ideas, all the unshared insights, all the stifled creativity of his crew accumulating and stagnating under his heavy hand. He saw the future clear as day. A succession of shrinking projects, angry clients, a dwindling crew, until finally the lights went out on Eugene's construction. He'd lose the truck, the house, the ability to send Leo to college, to give Sophia the chances Maria always talked about. His hands, calloused and strong, trembled slightly as he picked up a crumpled invoice. This wasn't just about making a profit anymore. This was about survival, about not becoming another casualty in the long line of small businesses that folded because the man at the top was too stubborn, too proud, too damn blind to see. He had spent his life building things, and now he realized he was on the verge of tearing down the most important thing of all, his family's future. The shame was a bitter taste in his mouth, a searing heat behind his eyes. He had to change. He just didn't know how. That night the house was quiet. Maria and the kids were asleep, their breathing soft counterpoints to the rhythmic hum of the refrigerator. Eugene sat at the kitchen table, the crumpled invoice still in his hand, the bitterness still in his mouth. He stared at the darkened window, seeing not his reflection but a long line of missed opportunities, of good men he'd pushed away, of dreams he'd suffocated, both theirs and his own. He'd always thought strength was about never showing weakness, about being the biggest dog in the yard. But what good was strength if it led to isolation? What good was being right if it meant everything around you crumbled? He felt hollowed out, a man who'd built a fortress around himself only to find he was trapped inside. A profound weariness settled over him, deeper than any physical exhaustion from a long day on the job. It was a weariness of the spirit, a soul-deep fatigue from fighting battles he didn't need to fight, from carrying burdens he should have shared. He didn't want this anymore. The thought wasn't a roar, not a shout of defiance. It was a whisper, barely audible even to himself, yet it resonated in every fiber of his being. Enough. Enough of the anger, enough of the fear, enough of being the bottleneck, the choke point, the guy everyone tiptoed around. Enough of being the reason his own damn company was circling the drain. He didn't know what was next. He had no grand plan, no new management philosophy neatly laid out in his head. The only thing he knew, with a certainty that cut through years of ingrained stubbornness, was that he couldn't keep doing what he'd been doing. The old way was a dead end. And if he wanted his company, his family, his life to have a future, he had to find a new path, even if it meant stumbling in the dark for a while. The alarm blared at 5 a.m., just like every other weekday. But this morning, it felt different. The air in the house was the same, the coffee smelled the same, but the man pouring it was not. Eugene's shoulders felt heavy, not just with the weight of the coming day, but with the silent promise he'd made to himself in the dead of night. He got to the site early, the first rays of dawn painting the sky in bruised purples and oranges. The crew started trickling in, a mix of old hands who'd seen him through thick and thin, and newer faces who hadn't yet fully succumbed to his particular brand of leadership. Carlos, his most senior guy, a quiet man who'd been with him 15 years, was already unloading a skid of lumber. Eugene walked over, his usual morning routine a gruff nod, maybe a terse question about the day's tasks. Today, his mouth felt dry. He watched Carlos expertly position the forklift, his movements efficient and practiced. The words felt foreign on his tongue when he finally spoke. "Morning, Carlos." Carlos paused, looked up, surprised by the lack of immediate direction. "Morning, boss." Eugene cleared his throat. "That roof section, the new trusses arrived this morning. I was thinking we could get the first 2 rows up before lunch, try and beat the heat." He stopped, the old urge to just tell taking over. But then he remembered the whisper. Enough. He took a breath. "What do you think? Any issues you see with that plan? Anything I'm missing?" Carlos blinked. He hadn't been asked for his opinion on a primary work task well, Eugene couldn't remember the last time. There was a flicker of suspicion in his eyes, a cautious curiosity. He shifted his weight, glancing at the trusses. "Well, boss," Carlos said slowly, picking his words. "We got a new guy on the crane today, first time with us. Might take a little longer to get him synced up with the signals. And that south corner. If we start there, the sun's gonna be right in his eyes for a good hour. Might be better to start north, get a few up, then swing around." Eugene's first instinct was to snap back, to assert his authority, to say he knew the damn sun patterns better than anyone. His jaw tightened. He could feel the old anger bubbling, the familiar heat behind his eyes. It was a battle, a real war in his gut. But then he looked at Carlos, really looked, and saw not just a worker, but a man who'd spent decades on roofs, a man who knew the rhythm of the job, the quirks of the site, the nuances of the sun's path better than any blueprint. He swallowed. "North first," he heard himself say, the words feeling heavy but right. "Good call. Tell the new crane operator to take his time. Safety first, no rush." Carlos's eyes widened almost imperceptibly. A faint, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement, not just for the instruction, but for something else. Something like surprise, maybe even respect. He turned back to the lumber, but his movements seemed to have a new spring to them. Eugene walked away, his heart thumping. It had been like pulling teeth, that conversation. Every fiber of his old self had screamed at him to dominate, to dismiss. But he hadn't. He had listened. And in that tiny, awkward moment, he hadn't dictated. He had served, even if just by acknowledging a better way, a different perspective. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And God, it was hard. Harder than pouring concrete in August. Harder than swinging a hammer all day. It was the hardest thing he'd done in a long, long time. But he had done it. That first night, Eugene barely slept. His mind was a battlefield. The quiet triumph of that conversation with Carlos was quickly overshadowed by the nagging voice that screamed, "What in the hell are you doing, Eugene? You're going soft. They'll walk all over you." He tossed and turned, the soft hum of Maria's steady breathing next to him doing little to calm the storm in his head. Every decision he'd ever made, every order he'd ever barked, every scowl he'd ever worn, it all felt like an old skin he was trying to shed, but the damn thing was stuck. Day 3 rolled in like a thick fog. He woke up with a headache that felt hammered into his skull. Stepping onto the site, the morning air was cold, damp, and unwelcoming. The crew was already moving, setting up, their usual banter muted. Eugene watched them, a knot tightening in his stomach. He saw Manny struggling with a heavy beam, his foot slipping on some loose gravel. The old Eugene would have roared, "Watch your damn feet, Manny. You want to break something. Get that beam secured now." But the words caught in his throat, a bitter taste. Instead, he took a deep breath, walked over, and without a word put his shoulder to the beam, helping Manny stabilize it until it was safely in place. Manny grunted a, "Thanks, boss," and it felt less like gratitude, more like surprise. Eugene just nodded, avoiding eye contact, the effort of holding back like a physical ache in his chest. Later, he caught himself about to snap at a younger guy for not lining up a cut perfectly. His hand was already rising, the usual finger point ready. He forced it down. "Here," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "Let me show you a trick." He took the saw, made the cut himself, slowly, deliberately, then handed it back. "Practice that takes time." The kid looked bewildered, then a flicker of understanding, maybe even admiration, crossed his face. These small victories felt enormous, yet exhausting. By day 7, Eugene was running on fumes. He felt like a man walking a tightrope over a canyon he couldn't see the bottom of, constantly fighting the urge to look down. The crew, bless their wary hearts, were starting to test the waters. They'd ask more questions, offer suggestions that were sometimes genuinely helpful, sometimes just suggestions. He'd found himself in the trailer one morning, surrounded by the smell of stale coffee and sawdust, listening to 3 different opinions on how to tackle a tricky foundation pour. His head spun. His old self screamed, "Shut up! I'll tell you how we're doing it." But he gritted his teeth, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the table. He listened. He asked clarifying questions. He picked the best parts of 2 ideas, added a refinement, and said, "All right. Let's try it this way. Miguel, you lead the prep on that section. Carlos, double-check the forms." It was excruciating. The process was slower, required more patience than he thought he possessed. Later that afternoon, a mistake did happen. A cement truck driver, new to the site, backed into a frame, bending a crucial support. The old Eugene would have erupted, fired the guy on the spot, torn into his crew for not supervising. This time he saw the driver's panicked face, the crew's immediate rush to assess the damage. He felt the familiar surge of red-hot anger, the burning desire to blame. He took 3 long, shuddering breaths. "All right," he said, his voice strained but steady. "Everyone calm down. Driver, you okay? It's just steel, we can fix steel." Juan grabbed the torches. "Manuel, get me the plans for this section. Let's see what we need to reinforce." He swallowed the bile of his frustration. He didn't yell, he didn't blame, he problem-solved. But when he got home, the silence in the house felt like a heavy blanket. Maria found him on the porch, staring out into the dark, a beer untouched in his hand. "Rough day?" she asked softly. He just grunted, the words too heavy to lift. He felt like he was losing a part of himself, not knowing what would replace it. The struggle was constant, a never-ending wrestling match with his own damn ego. Day 14 felt like the longest day of his life. 2 weeks. 2 weeks of biting his tongue, of actively not taking over, of forcing himself to listen, to trust, to teach instead of dictate. The weariness was bone-deep, not just physical from the labor, but a mental exhaustion that seeped into his very marrow. He walked the site, observing. He saw a few small improvements, a little more initiative here, a quicker solution there, a sense of ease that hadn't existed before. But the path ahead still felt like pushing a boulder uphill. He caught whispers sometimes. "Eugene's gone soft," or "What's gotten into the old man?" He knew they were talking about him. He knew they were still wary, still waiting for the other shoe to drop, for him to snap back into the old tyrant. He felt like giving up. This was too hard. His way, the old way, at least it was his way. He knew how to do that. This new way, it felt like fumbling in the dark. He found himself in the back of the pickup, eating a cold sandwich, staring at the plans. "What am I doing?" he muttered to himself, the words barely audible. "This ain't working. They ain't listening. It's just chaos." He almost called Maria, almost told her he was done, that he was going back to what he knew. But then he remembered Leo, his son, trying to fix that leaky faucet last week, getting frustrated, ready to throw the wrench across the room. Eugene hadn't yelled. He just watched, then quietly showed him the right way to hold the pipe, the trick to tightening the nut. And Leo, after a moment of frustration, had listened, and he'd fixed it. If I can do it for my boy, Eugene thought, why can't I do it for these fellas? They're just trying to build something, same as me. The thought was a small ember in the cold, a spark of stubborn, mule-headed resolve. He wasn't going to quit, not yet, not when he was this deep in. The battle raged on within him and around him every single day. The battle raged on within him and around him every single day. Then one sweltering Tuesday, something finally started to give. They were trying to lift a steel beam into place for a new mezzanine, a tricky spot up near the ceiling, and the rigging wasn't quite right. Old Eugene would have been bellowing, grabbing wrenches, pushing men aside. But today, the heat was already boiling his blood, and he was tired of the shouting. He watched Marco, one of his younger guys, a steady hand but not a talker, scratch his head, then gesture vaguely to another spot on the beam. "What is it, Marco?" Eugene grunted, his voice still rough but lacking the usual edge of immediate accusation. Marco flinched, expecting the blow-up, but seeing none, he straightened a bit. "Boss, if we shift the chain plate, just 6 inches further down, see? It'll give us a better angle. Less stress on the hoist, cleaner swing." He pointed, his finger tracing an imaginary line. Eugene felt the familiar heat rise. His first instinct was to snap, "I designed this, I know what I'm doing." He took a deep breath, the taste of dust in his mouth. He looked at the beam, then at Marco's earnest face, then back at the beam. The kid had a point. It would be a better angle, safer. He wanted to dismiss it, to save face, but a voice, a new, quieter one in his head, echoed Leo's words from the other day. "Why can't I do it for these fellas?" "All right," Eugene said, the word feeling foreign on his tongue. "Let's see it. Adjust it." Marco's eyes widened, a flicker of surprise, then something else, a tentative spark of respect. He moved quickly, directing 2 other guys to make the change. They worked in unusual quiet, Eugene watching, arms crossed, trying to swallow his pride. When they tried the lift again, the beam swung smooth, clean, locking into place with a satisfying thud. It was faster, easier than the initial plan. A quiet hum went through the crew. No high fives, no cheers, but a noticeable easing of tension. Marco met Eugene's gaze, a small, almost imperceptible nod. And for the first time in a long time, Eugene felt a different kind of satisfaction. Not the satisfaction of being right, but of seeing something done better because he'd gotten out of the way. Days turned into weeks, and those small shifts started piling up. It wasn't a lightning bolt, more like a slow, steady tide coming in. Eugene still worked as hard as any man on site, still had that intense stare, but now often it was followed by a question. "What do you see, Vinny?" Or, "Think this will hold, Jose?" He found himself not just asking, but genuinely listening. He started walking the site differently too, not just checking, but looking for what his crew needed. A broken tool. He'd get a replacement, not yell about carelessness. A question about the blueprint. He'd sit down, explain it patiently instead of grunting. He became the guy who cleared the path, not the guy who stood in the middle of it. The change wasn't just in Eugene, it rippled through the whole company. One morning, during a site meeting for a particularly complex residential build, a problem arose. The architect's plans for a load-bearing wall didn't quite line up with the reality of the existing foundation. Old Eugene would have slammed his fist, demanded the architect change the plans, and then probably made his crew force a square peg into a round hole. New Eugene leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, and looked at the faces around the table. "All right, fellas," he said, his voice calmer than anyone remembered. "We got a snag here. Architect says A, foundation says B. There are options." A silence, then Miguel, a young engineer fresh out of school, usually too timid to speak up, cleared his throat. "Boss, what if we use a reinforced steel header here?" He pointed to the plans. "And redistribute the load across these 2 joists. It's a bit more material, but it'd be structurally sound and wouldn't need a re-pour." Old Eugene would have scoffed at the kid. New Eugene nodded slowly. "Show me the calculations, Miguel. Walk us through it." Miguel, emboldened, launched into an explanation, his confidence growing with every word. By the end, the solution was clear, elegant, and had come from them. Eugene just guided the conversation, asked the sharp questions, made sure they hadn't missed anything. They implemented Miguel's plan, and the wall went up stronger than ever on schedule. The work environment itself felt different. The air wasn't thick with dread, but alive with purposeful sound. Jokes were heard, often followed by the clatter of tools. Men started taking initiative, solving small problems before they became big ones because they knew Eugene would listen if they brought a new idea, not yell. Turnover, once a constant bleed, slowed to a trickle. The crew became a team, a true unit. They were building things, yes, but they were also building trust, brick by painstaking brick. At home, Maria noticed it first. He was still tired at the end of the day, his hands still rough, but the deep lines of worry around his eyes had softened. He listened more when Leo talked about school or Sophia about her friends. He didn't bark when the kids left their shoes by the door. One evening, he sat on the porch swing with Maria, the last light fading from the sky. "It's weird, Maria," he confessed, his voice low. "For years, I thought I had to crack the whip, drive 'em hard. And we just barely kept our heads above water. Now, I'm just trying to make sure they got what they need, get out of their way, and we're flying." He shook his head, a faint, almost shy smile touching his lips. "Projects are finishing early, under budget. New clients are calling. We're hiring more good fellas." He used to think the only way to earn respect was to demand it. Now he saw it in the steady gazes of his crew, in the way they worked, in the pride they took in their craft. It was a respect freely given, earned through listening, through serving, through simply letting good men be good men. And it was a foundation stronger than any concrete slab he'd ever poured. The next spring, the company wasn't just staying afloat. It was growing. New contracts came in, bigger jobs than Eugene had ever dared to dream of. He found himself bidding on commercial builds, multi-unit housing projects, not just the usual residential add-ons and renovations. The crew, now a loyal core with new, eager faces joining their ranks, worked with an efficiency he'd never thought possible. They didn't just meet deadlines, they beat them often by a week or more. The quality of their work was impeccable, each nail driven true, each joint perfect, each finish smooth as glass. Word got around. Eugene's guys. People started saying, "They don't just build, they craft." He was still the foreman, still on site every single day, his boots still caked in mud or dust, his hands still scarred from years of labor. But the way he carried himself was different. He wasn't hunched over, burdened by the weight of every single decision. Instead, he moved with a calm authority, observing, listening, interjecting only when truly necessary. He saw problems from 20 paces, not because he was looking for mistakes, but because he was looking for ways to clear the path. A delivery truck stuck in the mud. He wasn't yelling at the driver. He was already calling for the skid steer to pull it out, asking what the driver needed next. A new guy struggling with a difficult cut. Eugene wasn't snatching the saw away. He was standing beside him, quiet, offering a tip or sometimes just a nod of encouragement. He saw the strength in their hands, the ingenuity in their heads, and he simply gave them the space and the tools to use it. One hot afternoon, standing on a newly poured foundation, watching his crew work like a well-oiled machine, laughter even cutting through the clang of hammers and the hum of saws, Eugene felt something profound settle in his chest. It wasn't the fear that used to gnaw at him, nor the anger. It was pride. A deep, quiet pride that made his calloused hands tremble ever so slightly. He saw Miguel, the young man he'd almost fired, now leading a small team, confidently directing the placement of rebar. He saw old Frank, the one he used to dismiss as slow, meticulously checking blueprints, his experience now valued, not just tolerated. He saw a company, yes, but more than that, he saw a community of men respecting each other, building something together, not just for him, but for them. He thought about the long nights he'd spent in the dark, the fear in his gut. He thought about that job that nearly broke him. He remembered the feeling of being utterly alone, despite being surrounded by his crew. Now he felt connected. He felt part of something bigger. He felt free. Later that evening, sitting at his kitchen table, the smell of Maria's cooking filling the air, he finally put words to it. He wasn't talking to anyone in particular, just sort of letting it spill out, a lifetime of lessons distilled into a few gruff sentences. "Used to think I had to be the loudest guy in the room to get things done," he grumbled, looking down at his rough hands, turning them over. "Believed I had to be the one barking orders, cracking the whip. That's what a boss did, right? Made all the calls, kept everyone in line." He paused, a wry chuckle escaping him. "Turns out, if you just listen to the fellas, give them what they need, and get out of their way, they'll build you a damn castle. A better one than you could ever dream of yourself." Looked up then, meeting Maria's gaze, a knowing warmth in his tired eyes. "It ain't about being the boss, Maria. Not really. It's about being the guy who helps everyone else be their best boss, helps them build something they can be proud of. And that's the truth of it, isn't it? Some men spend their lives trying to build monuments to themselves, only to find they're standing on shaky ground. Others, they learn to build bridges, not just of steel and stone, but of trust and respect. They learn to lift others up, not just hold them down. And in doing so, they build something that's